Chapter 6 of Murder in the Gunroom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Murder in the Gunroom by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 6. The Fleming butler, Walters, Rand remembered Gladys Fleming having called him, became apologetic upon learning who the visitor was. "Forgive me, Colonel Rand, but I'm afraid I must put you to some inconvenience, sir," he said. "You see, we have no chauffeur at present, and I don't drive very well myself. Would you object to putting up your own car, sir? The garage is under the house, at the rear. Just follow the driveway around. I'll go through the house and meet you there for the luggage. I'm dreadfully sorry to put you to the trouble, but—" "Oh, that's all right," Rand comforted him. "Just as soon do it myself now, anyhow. I expect to be in and out with the car while I'm here, and I'd better learn the layout of the garage now." "You may back in, sir, or drive straight in and back out," the butler told him. "One way's about as easy as the other." Rand returned to his car, driving around the house. A row of doors opened out of the basement garage. Walters, who must have gone through the house on the double, was waiting for him. Having what amounted to be a conditioned reflex to park his car so that he could get in and out as fast as possible, he cut over to the right, jockeyed a little, and backed in. There were already two cars in the garage, a big maroon Packard sedan and a sand-colored Packard station wagon, standing side by side. Rand put his Lincoln in on the left of the sedan. "Bags in the luggage compartment. It isn't locked," he told the butler, making sure that the glove compartment where he had placed the Leech & Rigdon revolver was locked. As he got out, the servant went to the rear of the car and took out the Gladstone and the B-4 bag Rand had brought with him. "If you don't mind entering the house from the rear, sir, we can go up those steps there, and through the rear hall," the butler suggested, almost as though he were making some indecent and criminal proposal. Rand told him to forget the protocol and lead the way. The butler picked up the bags and conducted him up a short flight of concrete steps to a landing and a door opening in a short hall above. An open door from this gave access to a longer hall, stretching to the front of the house, and there was a third door, closed, which probably led to the servants' domain. Rand followed his guide through the open door and into the long hall, which passed under an arch to extend to the front door. There was a door on either side, about midway to the arch under the front stairway. The one on the right was the dining room, Walters explained, and the one on the left was the library. He seemed to be still suffering from the ignominy of admitting a house guest through any but the main portal. Emerging into the front hallway, he put down the bags, took Rand's hat and coat and laid them on top of the luggage, and then went to an open doorway on the right, standing in it and coughing delicately before announcing that Colonel Rand was here. Gladys Fleming, wearing a pale blue frock, came forward as Rand entered the parlor, her hands extended. The two other women in the big parlor remained motionless. They would be the sisters, Geraldine Varsic and Nelda Dunmore. Rand didn't wonder that they resented Gladys so bitterly. Economic considerations aside, girls seldom enthuse over a stepmother so near their own age, who is so much more beautiful. "Good afternoon, Colonel Rand," Gladys said. "This is Mrs. Varsic." She indicated a very pale blonde who sat slumped in a deep chair beside a low cocktail table, a highball in her hand. "And Mrs. Dunmore." She was the brunette with the full bust and hips, in the short black skirt and the tight white sweater, who was standing by the fireplace. "Hello." The blonde, Geraldine, smiled shyly at him. She had big blue eyes and delicately tinted rose-petal lips that seemed to be trying not to laugh at some private joke. She wasn't exactly blotto, but she had evidently laid a good foundation for a first-class jag. After all, it was only 2:30 in the afternoon. The other sister, Nelda, didn't say anything. She merely stood and stared at Rand distrustfully. Rand doubted that she ordinarily gave men the hostile eye. The full dark red lips, the lush figure, the way she draped it against the side of the fireplace to catch the ruddy light on her more interesting curves and bulges. There was a bimbo just made to be leered at, and she probably resented it like hell if she weren't. Rand gave them a general good afternoon, then turned to Gladys. "I had a good talk with Goode, yesterday afternoon," he said. I have his authorization to handle all the details. As soon as I get an itemized list, I'll circularize dealers and other possible buyers and ask for offers." "Is that all?" Nelda demanded angrily of Gladys. "Why, Fred's done all that already." "Is that correct, Mrs. Fleming?" Rand asked for the record. "I told you yesterday what's been done," Gladys replied. "Fred has talked to one dealer, Arnold Rivers. There has been no inventory of any sort made." "Mr. Rivers is offering us $10,000, Nelda retorted. "I don't see why you had to bring this Colonel What's-his-name into it, at all. You think he can get us a better offer? If you do, you're crazy." $10,000 for a collection that ought to sell for 5 times that in Macy's basement," Geraldine hooted. "How much is Rivers slipping Fred on the side?" "Oh, go back to your bottle," Nelda cried. "You're too drunk to know what you're talking about." "They tell me Colonel Rand is a detective, too," Geraldine continued. "Maybe he can find out why Fred never talked to Stephen Gresham, or Carl Gwinnett, or anybody else except this Rivers. How much is Fred getting out of Rivers, anyhow?" "My God, Geraldine, shut up!" Nelda howled. Then she decided to take direct notice of Rand's presence. "Colonel Rand, I'm sorry to say that in her present condition, my sister doesn't know what she's saying. It's bad enough for my stepmother to bring an outsider into what's obviously a family matter, but when my sister begins making these ridiculous accusations—" "What's ridiculous about them?" Geraldine demanded, dumping another 2 ounces of whiskey into her glass and freshening it with a siphon. "I think Rivers offering $10,000 for the collection, and Fred's thinking we'd accept it, are the only ridiculous things about it." "That's rather what I told Rivers this afternoon," Rand put in. "He seemed a bit upset about my being brought into this, too, but he finally admitted that he was willing to pay up to $25,000 for the collection, and if he buys it, that's exactly what it's going to cost him." "What?" Nelda fairly screamed. Her hands opened and closed spasmodically. She was using a dark red nail tint that made Rand think of blood-dripping talons. "Mr. Arnold Rivers told me this afternoon, and I quote, 'I'm willing to pay up to $25,000 for that collection,' unquote," Rand said. "And I can tell you now that $25,000 is just what he will pay for it, unless I can find somebody who's willing to pay more, which is not at all improbable." "Hooray!" Geraldine waved her glass and toasted Rand with it. "And 25G ain't hay, brother." Gladys smiled quickly at Rand, then turned to Nelda. "Now I hope you see why I thought it was wise to bring in somebody who knows something about old arms," she said. Nelda evidently saw. There was apparently nothing stupid about her. "And Fred was going to take a miserable $10,000. The way she said it, 10,000 sounded like a fairly generous headwaiter's tip. "Did Rivers actually tell you he'd pay 25? Rand gave, as nearly verbatim as possible, his conversation with the dealer. "And he can afford it, too," he finished. "He can make a nice profit on the collection at that figure." "My God, do you mean the pistols are worth more than that, even?" she wanted to know, aghast. "Certainly, if you're a dealer with an established business, and customers all over the country, and want to take 5 or 6 years to make your profit," Rand replied. "If you aren't, and want your money in a hurry, no." "That's why I was against turning the collection over to Gwinnett on a commission basis," Gladys said. "It would take him 5 years to get anything sold." Nelda left the fireplace and advanced towards Rand. "Colonel, I owe you an apology," she said. "I had no idea Father's pistols were worth anywhere near that much. I don't suppose Fred did, either." She frowned. Wait till she gets Fred alone, Rand thought. I'd hate to be in his spot. "You say you're acting on Humphrey Goode's authority?" "That's right. I'll negotiate the sale, but the money will be paid directly to him, for distribution according to the terms of your father's will." Rand got out Goode's letter and handed it to Nelda. She read it carefully. "I see." She seemed greatly relieved. She was looking at Rand now as she was accustomed to look at men, particularly handsome 6-footers who were broad across the shoulders and narrow at the hips and resembled King Charles II. She was probably wondering if Rand was equal to Old Rowley in another important respect. I didn't understand. I thought—" A dirty look aimed at Gladys explained what she had thought. Then her glance fell on the bottle and siphon on the table beside Geraldine's chair, and she changed the subject by inquiring if Colonel Rand might like a drink. "Well, let's go up to the gunroom," Gladys suggested. "We can have our drink up there while Colonel Rand's looking at the pistols. Coming with us, Geraldine?" Geraldine rose, not too steadily, her glass still in her hand, and took Rand's left arm. Gladys, seeing Nelda moving in on the detective's right, took his other arm. Nelda was barely successful in suppressing a look of murderous anger. The double doorway into the hall was just wide enough for Rand and his two flankers to pass through. Nelda had to fall in a couple of paces rear of center, and wasn't able to come up into line until they were in the hall, upstairs. "There's the gunroom," Gladys pointed. "And that's your room over there." As she spoke, Walters came out of the doorway she had indicated. "Your bags are unpacked, sir," he reported. Then he told Rand where he would find his things, and where the bath was. There was a brief discussion of drinks. The butler received his instructions and went down the stairway. Rand broke up the feminine formation around him and ushered the ladies ahead of him into the gunroom. It was much as he remembered it from his visit of 2 years before. There was a desk in one corner, and back of it a short workbench and tool cabinet. There was a long table in the middle of the room, its top covered with green baize, upon which many flat rectangular boxes of hardwood rested, some walnut, some rosewood, some quartered oak. Each would contain a pistol or pair of pistols with cleaning and loading tools. In the corner farthest from the desk he saw the head of the spiral stairway from the library below mentioned by Gladys Fleming. There were ashstands and a couple of cocktail tables and a number of chairs and the old maple cobbler's bench on which Lane Fleming had died. The only books in the room were in a small case over the workbench. They were all arms books. Then he looked at the walls. On both ends, and on the long inside wall, the pistols hung, hundreds and hundreds of them. The cream of a lifetime's collecting. Horizontal white-painted boards had been fixed to the walls, about 4 feet from the floor, and similar boards had been placed 5 feet above them. Between, narrow vertical strips, as wide as a lath but twice as thick, were set. Rows of pistols were hung, the barrels horizontal on pairs of these strips, with screw hooks at grip and muzzle. There were about 100 such vertical rows of pistols. Rand was still looking at them when the butler brought in the drinks. When Gladys told the servant that that would be all, he went out, rather reluctantly, by the spiral stairs to the library. "Well, what do you think of them, Colonel Rand?" Gladys asked. Rand tasted his whiskey and looked around. "It's one of the finest collections in the country," he said. "I may even be able to find somebody who'll top Rivers's offer, but don't be disappointed if I don't. By the way, did anybody help Mr. Fleming keep this stuff clean? The room seems dry, but even so, they'd need an occasional wiping off." "Oh, Walters was always in here, going over the pistols," Nelda said. "He's been in here every day lately." "I wonder if you could spare him to help me a little. I'll need somebody who knows his way around here at first." "Why, of course," Gladys agreed. "He isn't very busy in the mornings, or in the afternoons till close to dinner time. Are you going to start work today?" "I'll have to. I'm going to see Stephen Gresham and his associates this evening, and I'll want to know what I'm talking about." They spent about 15 minutes over their drinks, talking about the collection. Rand and Gladys did most of the talking, in spite of Nelda's best efforts to monopolize the conversation. Geraldine, after a few minutes, retired into her private world and only roused herself when her sister and stepmother were about to leave. When they went out, Gladys promised to send Walters up directly. Rand heard her speaking to him at the foot of the main stairway. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Murder in the Gunroom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Murder in the Gunroom by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 7. When Walters entered, Rand had his pipe lit and was walking slowly around the room, laying out the work ahead of him. Roughly, the earliest pieces were on the extreme left, on the short north wall of the room, and the most recent ones on the right, at the south end. This was, of course, only relatively true. The pistols seemed to have been classified by type in vertical rows, and chronologically from top to bottom in each row. The collection seemed to consist of a number of intensely specialized small groups, with a large number of pistols of general types added. For instance, about midway on the long east wall, there were some 30-odd all-metal pistols, from the wheel-lock to the percussion. There was a collection of U.S. Marshals, with 2 rows of the regulation pistols, flintlock and percussion of foreign governments placed on the left, and the collection of Colts on the right. After them came the other types of percussion revolvers, and the latter metallic cartridge types. It was an arrangement which made sense from the arms student's point of view, and Rand decided that it would make sense to the dealers and museums to whom he intended sending lists. He would save time by listing them as they were hung on the walls. Then there were the cases between the windows on the west wall containing the ammunition collection, examples of every type of fixed pistol ammunition, and the collection of bullet molds and powder flasks and wheel-lock spanners and assorted cleaning and loading accessories. All that stuff would have to be listed, too. "I beg your pardon, sir," Walters broke in, behind him. "Mrs. Fleming said that you wanted me." "Oh, yes," Rand turned. "Is this the whole thing? What's on the walls here?" "Yes, sir. There is also a wall case containing a number of modern pistols and revolvers, and several rifles and shotguns in the room formerly occupied by Mr. Fleming, but they are not part of the collection, and they are now the personal property of Mrs. Fleming. I understand that she intends selling at least some of them on her own account. Then there is a quantity of ammunition and ammunition components in that closet under the workbench. Cartridges, primed cartridge shells, black and smokeless powder, cartridge primers, percussion caps. But they are not part of the collection either. I believe Mrs. Fleming wants to sell most of that, too." "Well, I'll talk to her about it. I may want to buy some of the ammunition for myself," Rand said. "So I only need to bother with what's on the walls in this room? By the way, did Mr. Fleming keep any sort of record of his collection? A book or a card index or anything like that?" "Why, no, sir." Walters was positive. Then he hedged. "If he did, I never saw or heard anything of this sort. Mr. Fleming knew everything in this room. I've seen him downstairs when somebody would ask him about something, close his eyes as though trying to visualize, and then give a perfect description of any pistol in the collection. Or else he could enumerate all the pistols of a certain type, say all the Philadelphia Derringers, or all the Allen pepper boxes, or all the rimfire Smith & Wesson tip-back types. He had a remarkable memory for his pistols, although it was not out of the ordinary otherwise, sir." Rand nodded. Any collector, at least any collector who was a serious arms student, could do that, particularly if he were a good visualizer and kept his stuff in some systematic order. At the moment, he could have named and described any or all of his own modest collection of 200-odd pistols and revolvers. "I was hoping he'd kept a record," he said. "A great many collectors do, and it would have helped me quite a bit." He made up his mind to compile such a record himself when he got back to New Belfast. It would be a big help to Carter Tipton when it came time to settle his own estate, and a man on whom the Reaper has scored as many near misses as on Jeff Rand should begin to think of such things. "And how about writing materials? And is there a typewriter available?" There was. A cased portable was on the floor beside the workbench. Walter showed him which desk drawers contained paper and other things. There was, Rand noticed, a loaded .38 Colt Detective Special in the upper right-hand desk drawer. "And these phones," the butler continued, indicating them. "This one is a private outside line. It doesn't connect with any other in the house. The other is an extension. It has a buzzer. The outside phones has a regular bell." Rand thanked him for the information. Then, picking up a notepad and pencil, he started on the left of the collection, meaning to make a general list and rough approximation of value for use in talking to Gresham's friends that evening. Tomorrow he would begin on the detailed list for use in soliciting outside offers. 25 wheel locks, 4 heavy South German dags, 2 singles and a pair, 3 Saxon pistols, with sharply dropped grips, a pair and 1 single, 5 French and Italian 16th century pistols, a pair of small pocket or sash pistols, a pair of French petronels, and an extremely long 17th century Dutch pistol with an ivory-covered stock and a carved ivory Venus head for a pommel, 8 17th century French, Italian, and Flemish pistols. Rand noted them down, and was about to pass on, then he looked sharply at one of them. It was nothing out of the ordinary as wheel locks go, a long Flemish weapon of about 1640, the type used by the Royalist cavalry in the English Civil War. There were 2 others almost like it, but this one was in simply appalling condition. The metal was rough with rust, and apparently no attempt had been made to clean it in a couple of centuries. There was a piece cracked out of the forend. The ramrod was missing, as was the front ramrod thimble. Both the trigger guard and the butt cap were loose, and when Rand touched the wheel, it revolved freely if sluggishly, betraying a broken spring or chain. The vertical row next to it seemed to be all snap-haunces, but among them Rand saw a pair of Turkish flintlocks. Not even good Turkish flintlocks. A pair of the sort of weapons hastily thrown together by native craftsmen or imported ready-made from Belgium for bazaar sale to gullible tourists. Among the fine examples of 17th century Brescian gun-making above and below it, these things looked like a pair of dog patchers in the Waldorf Starlight Room. Rand contemplated them with distaste, then shrugged. After all, they might have had some sentimental significance, say souvenirs of a pleasantly remembered trip to the Levant. A few rows farther on, among some exceptionally fine flintlocks, all of which predated 1700, he saw one of those big Belgian Navy pistols circa 1800, of the sort once advertised far and wide by a certain old army goods dealer for $6.95. This was a particularly repulsive specimen of its breed. Grimy with hardened dust and gummed oil, maculated with yellow surface rust, the brasswork green with corrosion. It was impossible to shrug off a thing like that. From then on, Rand kept his eyes open for similar incongruities. They weren't hard to find. There was a big army pistol of Central European origin and in abominable condition, among a row of fine multi-shot flintlocks. Multi-shot. Stephen Gresham had mentioned an Elisha Collier flintlock revolver. It wasn't there. It should be hanging about where this post-Napoleonic German thing was. There was no Hall-breech loader either, but there was a dilapidated old Ketland. There were many such interlopers among the U.S. Marshals. An English ounce-ball cavalry pistol, a French 1777 and a French 1773, a couple more .695 bargain counter specials, a miserable altered S. North 1816. Among the Colts there was some awful junk, including a big Spanish hinge-frame .44 and a Belgian imitation of a Webley RIC model. There weren't as many Paterson Colts as Gresham had spoken of, and the Whitneyville Walker was absent. It went on like that. About a dozen of the best pistols which Rand remembered having seen from 2 years ago were gone, and he spotted at least 20 items which the late Lane Fleming wouldn't have hung in his backyard privy if he'd had one. Well, that was to be expected. The way these pistols were arranged, the absence of one from its hooks would have been instantly obvious. So, as the good stuff had moved out, these disreputable changelings had moved in. "You had rather a shocking experience here in Mr. Fleming's death," Rand said over his shoulder to the butler. "Oh, yes, indeed, sir." Walters seemed relieved that Rand had broken the silence. "A great loss to all of us, sir, and so unexpected." He didn't seem adverse to talking about it, and went on at some length. His story closely paralleled that of Gladys Fleming. "Mr. Varcek called the doctor immediately," he said. "Then Mr. Dunmore pointed out that the doctor would be obliged to notify either the coroner or the police, so he called Mr. Goode, the family solicitor. That was about 20 minutes after the shot. Mr. Goode arrived directly. He was here in about 10 minutes. I must say, sir, I was glad to see him. To tell the truth, I had been afraid that the authorities might claim that Mr. Fleming had shot himself deliberately. Somebody else doesn't like the smell of that accident, Rand thought. Aloud, he said, "Mr. Goode lives nearby, then, I take it?" "Oh, yes, sir. You can see his house from these windows, over here, sir." Rand looked out the window. The rain-soaked lawn of the Fleming residence ended about 100 yards to the west. Beyond it, an orchard was beginning to break into leaf, and beyond the orchard and another lawn stood a half-timbered, Tudor-style house, somewhat smaller than the Fleming place. A path led down from it to the orchard, and another led from the orchard to the rear of the house from which Rand looked. "Must be comforting to know your lawyer's so handy," he commented. "And what do you think, Walters? Are you satisfied in your own mind that Mr. Fleming was killed accidentally?" The servant looked at him seriously. "No, sir, I'm not," he replied. "I've thought about it a great deal since it happened, sir, and I just can't believe that Mr. Fleming would have that revolver and start working on it without knowing that it was loaded. That just isn't possible, if you'll pardon me, sir. And I can't understand how he would have shot himself while removing the charges. The fact is, when I came up here at 7:15 to call him for cocktails, he had the whole thing apart and spread out in front of him." The butler thought for a moment. "I believe Mr. Dunmore had something like that in mind when he called Mr. Goode." "Well, what happened?" Rand asked. "Did the coroner or the doctor choke on calling it an accident?" "Oh, no, sir, there was no trouble of any sort about that. You see, Dr. Yardman called the coroner as soon as he arrived, but Mr. Goode was here already. He'd come over by that path you saw to the rear of the house, and in through the garage, which was open since Mrs. Dunmore was out with the coupe. They all talked it over for a while, and the coroner decided that there would be no need for any inquest, and the doctor wrote out the certificate. That was all there was to it." Rand looked at the section of pistol rack devoted to Colts. "Which one was it?" he asked. "Oh, it's not here, sir," Walters replied. "The coroner took it away with him." "And hasn't returned it yet?" "Well, he has no business keeping it. It's part of the collection and belongs to the estate." "Yes, sir, if I may say so, I thought it was a bit high-handed of him taking it away myself, but it wasn't my place to say anything about it." "Well, I'll make it mine. If that revolver's what I'm told it is, it's too valuable to let some damned country-seat politician walk off with." A thought occurred to him. "And if I find that he's disposed of it, this county's going to need a new coroner, at least till the present incumbent gets out of jail." The buzzer of the extension phone went off like an annoyed rattlesnake. Walters scooped it up, spoke into it, listened for a moment, and handed it to Rand. "For you, sir. Mrs. Fleming." "Colonel Rand, Carl Gwinnett, the commission dealer I told you about, is here," Gladys told him. "Do you want to talk to him?" "Why, yes. Do I understand now that you and the other ladies want cash, and don't want the collection peddled off piecemeal?" "All right, send him up. I'll talk to him." A few minutes later, a short, compact-looking man of 40-odd entered the gunroom, shifting a briefcase to his left hand and extending his right. Rand advanced to meet him and shook hands with him. "You're Colonel Rand? Enjoyed your articles in the Rifleman," he said. "Mrs. Fleming tells me you're handling the sale of the collection for the estate." "That's right, Mr. Gwinnett. Mrs. Fleming tells me you're interested." "Yes. Originally, I offered to sell the collection for her on a commission basis, but she didn't seem to care for the idea, and neither do the other ladies. They all want spot cash and a lump sum. Yes, Mrs. Fleming herself might have been interested in your proposition if she'd been sole owner. You could probably get more for the collection, even after deducting your commission, than I'll be able to, but the collection belongs to the estate and has to be sold before any division can be made." "Yes, I see that. Well, how much would the estate, or you, consider a reasonable offer?" "Sit down, Mr. Gwinnett," Rand invited. "What would you consider a reasonable offer yourself? We're not asking any specific price, we're just taking bids, as it were." "Well, how much have you been offered to date?" "Well, we haven't heard from everybody. In fact, we haven't put out a list, or solicited offers, except locally as yet. But one gentleman has expressed a willingness to pay up to $25,000. Gwinnett's face expressed polite skepticism. "Colonel Rand," he protested, "you certainly don't take an offer like that seriously." "I think it was made seriously," Rand replied. "A respectable profit could be made on the collection, even at that price." Gwinnett's eyes shifted over the rows of horizontal barrels on the walls. He was almost visibly wrestling with mental arithmetic, and at the same time trying to keep any hint of his notion of the collection's real value out of his face. "Well, I doubt if I could raise that much," he said. "Might I ask who's making this offer?" "You might. I'm afraid I couldn't tell you. You wouldn't want me to publish your own offer broadcast, would you?" "I think I can guess. If I'm right, don't hold your head in a tub of water till you get it," Gwinnett advised. "Making a big offer to scare away competition is one thing, and paying off on it is another. I've seen that happen before, you know. Fact is, there's one dealer not far from here who makes a regular habit of it. He'll make some fantastic offer, and then, when everybody's been bluffed out, he'll start making objections and finding faults, and before long he'll be down to about a quarter of his original price." "The practice isn't unknown," Rand admitted. "I'll bet you don't have this $25,000 offer on paper, over a signature," Gwinnett pursued. "Well, here." He opened his briefcase and extracted a sheet of paper, handing it to Rand. "You can file this. I'll stand back of it." Rand looked at the typed and signed statement to the effect that Carl Gwinnett agreed to pay the sum of $15,000 for the Lane Fleming pistol collection, in its entirety, within 30 days of date. That was an average of $6 a pistol. There had been a time, not too long ago, when a pistol collection with an average value of $6, particularly one as large as the Fleming collection, had been something unusual. For one thing, arms values had increased sharply in the meantime. For another, Lane Fleming had kept his collection clean of the $2 items, which dragged down so many collectors' average values. Except for the 24 odd mysterious interlopers, there wasn't a pistol in the Fleming collection that wasn't worth at least $20, and quite a few had values expressible in 3 figures. "Well, your offer is duly received and filed, Mr. Gwinnett," Rand told him, folding the sheet and putting it in his pocket. "This is better than an unwitnessed verbal statement that somebody is willing to pay $25,000. I'll certainly bear you in mind." "You can show that to Arnold Rivers if you want to," Gwinnett said. "See how much he's willing to commit himself to, over his signature." End of Chapter 7.